Welcome to Forecasting Impact, a podcast brought to you by the International Institute of Forecasters. This show brings together experts from academia and industry to discuss a wide range of subjects on forecasting science and practice in business, society, economy, healthcare, and education. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us today.
Hello and welcome back to Forecasting Impact, everyone. I'm Leila Aklagi, one of your hosts today, and joining me for this conversation is my co-host, George Borritos. Did I say that right, George?
Borritos, but it's the same. No problem.
Borritos. Hey, George, how you doing?
I'm great. How about you, Leila?
Good, thank you. And today we're joined by Harrison Katz. Harrison leads finance data science strategy at Airbnb, where he leads the forecasting work behind earnings, treasury operations, and strategic planning across hundreds of global markets. He holds a PhD in statistics from UCLA, and before Airbnb, he held research positions at the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors. His research program focuses on Bayesian methods for compositional and hierarchical time series, with multiple papers published in the International Journal of Forecasting and contributions to Foresight and other leading forecasting and tourism journals. He also writes on the governance of forecasting inside organizations, which we're going to speak about a little bit today. So, Harrison, tell us about your journey and how you got into forecasting.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's great to meet you both. So my journey to forecasting was kind of similar to my journey to academia. Altogether, it was nonlinear and kind of filled by happenstance. So I dropped out of high school when I was 15. I got my GED. Yeah, so I don't have the usual background of a senior person in data science. But I ended up transferring to UCLA after spending a few years at community college. I was interested in political science, political economics, and I had a professor who pretty bluntly told me that, hey, if you want to do anything in this field, you got to learn a lot more math than you probably have dropping out of high school at 15. I'd stopped at Calc 1. So I took his advice and, I slowly started taking more and more math classes until kind of the math took over. That led to a master's in math and stats at Georgetown and a research position at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and risk analysis. I think the Fed was probably the first place that I kind of saw forecasting, in my day-to-day life. The whole place obviously runs on them, but it was also the first place I saw, that a forecast was more than just a number that, a model produces. And it was an intrinsically political object that lives within an organization and, that actually influences decisions. It was the first time I've seen people argue about, a number that a model produced. Fast forward a few years, and I decided at that point to leave the Fed to do a PhD in statistics at UCLA. I think the reason I left was that at that point, I decided that methods and models themselves were a little bit more interesting than what I was pointing them to, what I was actually solving them with the Fed. Yeah, so I started my PhD in statistics at UCLA. I thought I was going to do something really theoretical and not at all forecasting related. I thought I was going to do Bayesian model averaging in this high dimensional space. And then a few years into that program, I actually ended up losing one of my best friends quite suddenly. And I was, just completely lost in grief or lost, beside myself with the whole thing. And I had another friend from my master's program, Sean, who was on the forecasting team at Airbnb. And, he knew I was not interested in forecasting, but I think he just didn't want to leave me alone with my grief and was pretty insistent that I come join the team as a summer PhD intern. That was almost 7 years ago to the day. I never left. I ended up finishing my PhD while at Airbnb. I've held various roles within this team, and now I actually run the team that is in charge of our top line forecast across hundreds of markets, and they support earnings, treasury, and planning for both business and finance. So, like I said, kind of a non-linear story.
Thanks for sharing with us, Harrison.
That's an amazing story, Harrison. Thanks for sharing all this. I wanted to ask you about the role of forecasting at Airbnb, especially if it is about demand forecasting. Is it about pricing or something else?
Yeah. So this is a good question. It's one I get quite frequently. I think that the easiest way to think about it is that my team owns the top line forecasts, financial forecast, which is the forward view that we give finance, treasury, and leadership to plan against. It feeds, earnings prep and treasury and planning and strategic planning across markets. So that includes things like initiatives, launches, and marketing spends. But there is kind of a clean line, because I think people kind of hear Airbnb and they assume most of our forecasting is probably going to be around pricing. And there are actual teams that, handle both pricing and search rankings as their own functions. But like what my team owns is the kind of top line, everything from bookings to cancellations to length of stay to gross booking value, all the way down to revenue. You can kind of view it as everything that is in the demand funnel of the business.
Oh, that's really fascinating. That actually, there are some automatic pricing changes that might happen with some of these websites. So I assume some of your forecasts go into that or not.
Probably not directly. We do have, so with Airbnb, hosts set the prices. So, as a company, we can suggest prices, like
Right.
initiatives like smart pricing. And there are
Yeah.
teams that are, in charge of, figuring out what those prices should be suggested at, but they don't directly feed into like the forecast that we have.
Yeah, I think that's the smart pricing that I had heard about. So 7 years ago, you joined would have been pre-COVID, and then COVID hit, I assume. So how did that affect how you work, and what did that teach you about the limitations of what forecasting can do?
Yeah. So COVID was a very probably the most challenging and exhausting time of my professional career. Uh, I learned a few lessons that stuck with me. I think that the first one is truly just, how models die, or how forecasting models kind of collapse. And, what I've learned is that they tend to degrade quietly. So you have these models or systems that you've, trained and calibrated over years and years of data. And then there's some type of regime shift in the world, changes under its feet, and it gives you very confident, very wrong answer. And like as a team, as a forecaster, as an organization, like you're kind of less, I don't know, like grasping to like for what to do next. You don't know whether you should, give it a few more observations, then hope that it can kind of suss out the signal, the new signal that is out there. You don't really know if you should add a feature, something exogenous or endogenous that you feel like is obviously relevant in this 3-week period that you've known this new world in, or whether you should, just kind of start over, like from scratch and build something new. And I think that, my team, to the way people like iterate through grief, iterated through each of those different stages before, finally landing on it was time to start something new, to like scrap our old model, our old system, and build something from scratch. And that's what we ended up doing. I think that the cool thing that we did there, the interesting thing that we did there, was we ended up separating the forecast of our flow metrics, which would be everything booking, number of bookings, the number of nights booked, how much gross booking value there is, cancellations, alterations, and so on, from the lead time. So the lead time would be the distance between when people book and when they stay, or when they book and when they canceled, or when they canceled and they stayed. So we ended up, treating these as two different forecasting processes. The reason we did that was, obviously the pandemic affected all sides of our business. But in many ways, like the gross demand side of things were not the hardest to predict. I mean, even at the height of the lockdowns, the number may not have been where we wanted it to be. It was probably a lot lower than we had seen historically, but it's, forecasting straight lines, not the hardest thing in the world. But the lead time distributions were just the complete opposite. They were like completely different than anything we had seen previously. You had some guests that would book tomorrow and 2 days from now, and then you'd have guests that would book 500 days in the future, being like, well, this thing will probably be over by then. And then there's like hollowing out in the middle. So you have like a bathtub. And then every reopening, like another closing, another shutdown, the variants, the vaccine rollouts would all affect these lead time distributions in different ways. So that was kind of the first, thing that we built. And in terms of like actual lessons I took away from this, though, I mean, don't get me wrong, we built a lot of very cool stuff. The 2-part forecasting, we did a lot of cool things with prior propagation, where we would borrow information from, regions that got hit first, via like the posteriors, then move them as priors to regions that had kind of a lagged effect. But all of that didn't really matter that much. I think that like the key lesson I learned was to kind of be model agnostic or system agnostic, that there really is no one forecasting model or system that rules them all or is best for every class of problems. And it's good not to be too dogmatic or to take it personally when a class of models, even one that worked beautifully before, kind of stops working because, what do you do? The needs of the business change, the world changes, and you kind of have to be able to make this Bayesian to update your priors based off of the information that you're getting, even if that means, throwing away something that you've worked a lot.
Mm.
For your new forecasting model or models, did you take into consideration any COVID-related indices like prevalence or incidence or something like that, or no?
We definitely did, but then you end up in one of the things that we learned is you end up solving a hard problem with a harder problem sometimes, because then you have to also forecast those, case loads, incidence loads, or whatever. So I think that was pretty useful for scenario analysis and thinking about kind of generally like whether a region would go through another period of lockdown and what that would mean. But in terms of the actual raw cases or things like that, you're at that point, we would either be reliant on someone else's forecast or we'd have to spend a lot of time forecasting it ourselves.
So Harrison, you've said that the word forecasts get used in a company or an organization in a lot of different ways. And so that's where a lot of problems may start. What do you mean by the word forecast when you use it?
Yeah. So this is something I've gotten very into recently. And it's this whole notion of forecast governance. And you'll have to bear with me because I'm not even 100% sure that all of these definitions are clearly distinct in my mind because there's just a lot of overlap between them. But from my point of view, I think that a forecast is fundamentally four things. And the first is what I call the estimate, which I think is what we all kind of think about as a forecast, or most people think about it as a forecast. That is going to be, all things being equal, your best guess, whether that's a point estimate or a shape of an outcome distribution. It's where you would probably put money if you were forced to. So I guess the estimate should be unbiased and well calibrated. But once again, this is pretty hand wavy on what exactly those two definitions mean. Yeah. The second would be this idea of a plan. And plan is something that an organization commits resources against. So it is kind of an asymmetric loss function on the forecast itself. Where does this come into organizations? If it's better to have more cash than less cash, you're going to plan to be more conservative. It's where you end up hearing sentences like wrong in the right direction kind of things. After the plan, you have the scorecard, which is basically where you want to use a forecast for either interrupted time series or any type of level of attribution. So if you want to see how effective a marketing campaign was, scorecard becomes like a frozen vintage of the estimate. It's the estimate before this happened, and then kind of looking at the effect afterwards. And then the hardest, most complicated part of this is what I call the signal. And to me, the signal is some either public or quasi-public base or view of the forecast distribution of the estimate that has the potential to change the outcome of what the estimate is supposed to be measuring. So let me give a concrete example of this. The Cook Political Report, they rank congressional races. They forecast congressional races competitiveness. And if they rate a race as competitive, that race is more likely to get more money, which, literature shows is more likely to make them more competitive. So there's like a feedback loop between the forecast and the outcome. And I'm sure there are a lot of, internal, either at Airbnb or other industries or organizations where that is also the case. But it's anytime that the forecast can actually change behavior and the outcome of the thing that it's forecasting, I view that as the signal. And I think that, the part that, where this gets a little messy for companies is that like really only the estimate is real and the scorecard is really just a frozen copy of it. And the plan and the signal are both derived from it, departures from it, depending on the distribution. And most like political arguments that I've seen about forecasts aren't usually accuracy questions. They're just debating which of these numbers they should be talking about or what the forecast should actually be doing.
Just to add on to this question, because I think it's very relevant, especially when we are talking about definitions. Sometimes we see teams arguing about the right number and the right forecast and testing and so on and so forth. But in the end, it's all about politics or incentives or things like that. So have you seen that based on your experience? What's usually the reason behind all these arguments?
I think that the reason that we have these arguments is back to the whole forecast governance is that we aren't clearly defining what the forecast objective should be. And so if, it is very rational. Like, let me give an example of where I think this kind of breaks down, or I've seen this break down in, my own line of work. It is very rational for a business or a finance organization to have a conservative plan because it is better to be wrong in one direction for them than it is to be in the other. So they're not even to say that they are like a biased estimate isn't even the right description, right? They could be a very unbiased estimate of a lower quantile. They're just not, they're a biased estimate of the mean, but they could be a unbiased estimate of the 40th quantile. And there's actually some cool literature out there on trying to figure out what quantile analysts are actually estimating. But where this creates conflict is sometimes you'll use the plan and then try and use it as a scorecard as well to say how well did this initiative work. And if you have a conservative forecast, the initiatives always look like they are achieving great success, and that it kind of hides the effect because it's not really driven by overperformance of a marketing campaign or overperformance of a product launch. It's just driven by a conservative sandbagged forecast. And I think that this actually gets worse during downturns. That's when this becomes the most problematic because you can end up being in line with forecast despite there actually being structural challenges to the organization. And it buries that. Leadership becomes the last to know because everything looks like, everything's green on the dashboards come end of month, even though that was kind of created by design.
Oh, yeah. So sometimes then when these things happen and these incentives exist, someone will go in and change the forecast. And you just talked about some of those reasons, but what are some of the other reasons that might be happening and why does that matter?
Yeah. So we call them manual adjustments here. And I think that there are kind of two ways you can think about, or two camps you can think about manual adjustments, and they can look quite similar on paper. And that's kind of why I think, creating these definitions or verbalizing it has helped me figure out what it is the adjustments are doing. So one group of adjustments is going to be including exogenous information that your model is incapable of knowing. Now, you can argue that your model should be capable of knowing and that you should build these things into it, and that's a whole different discussion. But you can imagine, for instance, a regulation that is coming into effect that is going to affect an estimate of how much it's going to affect supply in this area, and you don't want to wait 3 observations or 5 observations for your model to detect this in real time. So it makes sense to have some level of either scenario analysis or manual adjustments to shift the distribution based off this new information. Really, it's like most Bayesian thing you can do. You have all this new information and you're just updating your entire distribution. But where you kind of run into trouble is that if, let's say, the same team that is responsible for including that information is also responsible for creating the plan, you can kind of use one as an excuse to adjust the forecast one direction. And then it becomes hard to really ascertain what the best guess of the forecast is versus what is just conservative hedging being built into the adjustment process.
How do you, as lead of this team, limit these incentives? Do you keep these structures or different organizations separate from each other? Do you have the responsibilities split across folks so they're not influencing each other in this, perverse incentives?
Yeah, that is what I think the ultimate solution is, and that is what I've seen work the best. Now, just to be clear, this was an org decision that was made above my pay grade. So there's a finance layer on top of, the forecast that my team produces. All credit to my VP, Adam List. He thinks very probabilistically and very analytically, and that was one of the first decisions he made. I think it's a very good one because you separate those processes, and then you can really see, okay, these are the best guests, and these are responsible for the plan. A decoupling or the decomposition becomes much clearer versus if you have it all baked together, it kind of becomes like a sausage, right? Where it's hard to tell, what's right and what.
Going beyond major shocks like, for instance, COVID and once in a lifetime shocks, things like that. Have you seen any model that you have developed or someone else has developed within your organization that was successful initially, let's say for a quarter or 2 quarters, and then completely collapsed. And if yes, what was the reason? It was a market dynamic change. It was a parameter that you missed and eventually was important and you realized next quarter or something different.
Yeah. I mean, so you kind of have to separate. This is like where forecast decomposition kind of becomes the most relevant, right? It's, did the world fundamentally change and was your model even capable of capturing it? That's one question that you kind of have to suss out. And that should be pretty apparent just by looking at the actual data, right? So if the actuals look nothing like they used to, going as far back as you can see, then there's probably some type of regime shift that your model was not, did not have the capabilities to capture. In that sense, it kind of feels like almost like a value at risk kind of model. Like which part of the distribution should your model be focused on? You really shouldn't expect a good forecast model to be able to capture every single tail event. And if this is truly a tail event, then like there was nothing your model could do to begin with. But if that's not the case, and you have seen this type of thing, let's say quite frequently, then it's probably a missing feature within the model, at least in my experience. So it could be a shifting holiday or, a sporting event that doesn't happen on a regular cadence. You've seen it before. It was a blip and maybe like you just didn't encode it correctly. And so then that becomes kind of a model specification or a model tuning issue. Have I seen this? Yes, I've seen this quite frequently. If nothing, the last 7 years have been very chaotic in terms of macro events and the world of travels.
Yeah. Multiple once in a lifetime events in the past decade or so. Unfortunately. And they keep coming, keep on coming.
So, Harrison, a lot of your research is based on predicting, you said, the flow. So it's a mix of things. It's people going to different places for different lengths of time, et cetera, kinds of vacations that they're looking for. So why is that different or harder as a problem than it might sound to be initially?
Yeah. So I think that the cleanest example of this is what kind of got this all started for me, which is modeling lead times. So if I think about like my research program, the arc of it over like the last 7 years, it really started with lead time forecasting. And part of that was driven by COVID, but it's also kind of it's one of the fundamental things that makes forecasting in hospitality more challenging than I think a lot of people assume. Because when people book is not necessarily when they stay. And you get very different seasonalities depending on whether you're looking at this from a booking date access or a trip date access. The cleanest example of this is people book for the holidays quite a bit. So if you look at, nights booked leading up to a holiday, very strong. But almost nobody books on the holidays themselves. So nights booked on the holiday is very low. But if you look at, night stayed, which is when people are actually staying in Airbnbs, it's the exact opposite, right? You have just this huge spike around the holidays and the rest could be, weekends or, work days, depending on like where they're traveling for and the guest composition. I think that where it gets kind of interesting is there are, I want to say like good lead times and bad lead times. And that so from a business standpoint, cancellations happen, of course. But you really don't want a last minute cancellation. That's probably the hardest one to refill, right? Like it's going to be, the host may not be able to then fill that listing. And so that would be kind of a bad lead time. Well, a good lead time would be probably very long and stable. Long and short of all of this is basically that I think that lead times are kind of what drove this whole notion of modeling directly onto simplex or modeling the distribution of them, because there's a lot more to it than just the average or median or any other like point estimate that gives information the business needs to know. And the other reason this is pretty relevant is from a revenue standpoint. We as a company don't actually realize the revenue until check-in. Basically, check-in plus one is the technical rules. A lot of bookings can happen, but we don't actually realize that revenue until they check in. So knowing that distribution and how to connect the two of them is really important for planning and guidance.
Makes sense.
I wanted to ask you something about supply and demand, which is obviously important for a marketplace like Airbnb. And I've heard you many times arguing that supply and demand should be coupled and not forecasted in a separate way in isolation. I personally 100% agree with what you said, but I wanted to ask you what's the underlying rationale behind that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the traditional approaches predicts demand against a roughly fixed amount of capacity. And for a lot of hospitality or travel, that makes sense, right? If you think about, an airline, it takes a lot of time to build a new airplane, I imagine, and a lot of money. I don't know. I don't. I've never forecasted for airplanes, but I imagine that there's a lot of fixed cost constraints there. Same with hotels. Hotels are rather sticky. It probably takes a lot of time to build a new hotel. So it kind of makes sense that you have this slow and sticky capacity because you can't really add thousands of rooms overnight. But on a platform like ours, supply is really elastic at almost every margin. So, hosts come and go and listings switch on and off, and people change their availability day to day. And the thing that's tying those together is really just kind of this two-sided marketplace. And this is actually most important when demand is high, right? Because if we know that there's a lot of demand going into some city or some region, we should try and increase our supply to match it. That's literally what the job of the two-sided marketplace, or what a platform like ours should be. So what I've been arguing for is that if you forecast demand as if supply is just fixed, when they're actually like responding to the same signals, whether that be exogenous or endogenous, you kind of run into identification problem. And I've shown that you can show how this falls apart in simulation, but we see this all the time, within industry, that the same initiatives that may stimulate aggregate demand can have downstream effects on other metrics like cancellations or other things that then influence supply, which then can have a feedback loop to demand. So really just kind of ignoring half the equation or half the equation if you're just focusing on one or the other.
So you're more like Uber, let's say, rather than hospitality yield management.
I think there's yes, there are similarities to both, but I don't think anyone would have an issue with that.
So, Harrison, you keep an active academic research program going at the same time as you're running the production forecasting at Airbnb. Does one feed off the other?
I think I've learned to help them feed off each other. It's not been the most natural evolution. It's taken a lot of effort, but it's something that I value quite a bit because the feedback loop is, pretty positive, I think. Every paper I've written started as a production problem that was either breaking or, that could be improved. And then, the research pushes back the other way and makes the production systems more rigorous. And I think that forecasting is one of those weird fields that is quite niche. So you can feel quite siloed sometimes. There are not that many people that do forecasting or do forecasting well. And there have been times where I've just left to my own devices. I'm like, I don't know if this is a great idea or if I'm just high. And having an external, having somebody that's can come in with an external point of view and be like, actually, no, this is clever. Or, oh, you should read this research because it contradicts everything you thought. I'm like, okay, that's very valuable to me as well.
You are an exception because usually we see practitioners focusing on just their forecasting job, and then you have scientists releasing their papers and so on and so forth. Both are obviously interesting and important, but we are doing both. And has this advanced your career, or you're just taking the joy out of it? And this is why you're doing it?
I mean, I don't think it hurts. I don't think it hurts the career at all. I think it's good to have some public-facing view of, your work and to have, once again, that academic validation or scientific validation for the methods and models that you work on. I do think that there's probably a more personal reason that stems from dropping out of high school at a very young age. A forecast or model gets superseded, as we've talked about, but a paper, a method that does stick around. It's nice to have these artifacts that you can point to. I have this instinct to build things that last, probably because I had to prove things the hard way a lot of my life. And I think so there's a very personal attachment I have to the academic side of this. I found myself at Airbnb, like I said, by happenstance, and there's always part of me that's what could have been if I was just in a pure academic route. And I think that this kind of lets me live a little bit in both worlds.
Do you have collaborations with other university institutions or colleagues? And how do you keep that going with the work that you're doing at Airbnb?
Yeah, so I have a lot of academic collaborations. I think the key point is probably to try and pick collaborators whose interests align with real problems or real industry problems. And it's not just, a collaboration for collaboration's sake, which it's data science sometimes can feel that way. It can feel a little like it's just, collaborations for collaboration's sake, and they're too far removed from the business. I think that is one of the benefits of my org is that I'm never a solution in search of a problem. Like I have nothing but new forecasting problems to work on. I'm lucky for that because a lot of data scientists, not just at Airbnb, but elsewhere throughout the entire industry, I feel like we're kind of struggling with this like identity crisis of what does it mean to be a data scientist these days. But back to the back to the collaborations, it's gotten I've gotten better at it. It's a challenge with IP. It's a challenge with figuring out what are the problems that can be shown on aggregated enough data that of course respects privacy and so on, and then figuring out like what legal and tech brand will tolerate. So that's been many years of practice, trial and error, but I think I found the right middle ground at this point.
I've seen many challenges with forecasting teams. I wanted to ask you about that. For their job to be taken seriously outside the forecasting team, especially when you are discussing with business stakeholders with a different business mindset, different communication style, and all this stuff. Have you seen that? And if yes, what will be your advice to other people in your position in the forecasting community?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that, and I think that it can be pretty easy for us to kind of just produce a number in a box if you're not careful. To just maintain a production forecast that is no longer relevant. And so, my first advice to them would be, the best roles in industry are usually ones that you kind of define yourself or you partially build, and not the ones that you find formal, like fully formed when you join. The shape of my own team is something I've had to work hard on defining what our scope is, how it's changed over time. Like we talked about, like where adjustments live and what, how we should think about adjustments that are for accuracy or adjustments that are built into conservatism. Those are all kind of like a work in progress. They're not just fully established once you join. So being flexible and being willing to kind of advocate for, the system you think as it should be is quite important. The other advice I'd give is to write, write for the people that you're actually trying to influence, not just, not just for the International Journal of Forecasting, even though we should all be writing for them as well. But like you should be writing Medium posts, you should be writing, like short notes that your stakeholders can understand and being able to explain the model to them at their level, because that is so much more valuable than just having a model that nobody but your team, knows how it works or nobody but your team appreciates.
So it's leadership more than it's the analytical framework and skills, if I understand correctly.
For industry, I would argue that is correct. And also, the other thing that's probably important, and this ties back to one of the first things I said about being, model agnostic or system agnostic, is you shouldn't be afraid reshaping the question or trying to reshape the question when it's necessary. There are a lot of forecasts that they're maintained because that's how it used to be. There's like production of cuts that may not even be relevant anymore. And a good example of this would be, prior to the pandemic, it may have been a valid business question to ask about the number of guests coming from Munich to New York. But in March of 2020, like a model that produces that gives us no insights into that world. You're just chasing noise at that point. And if you're, grinding out these forecast models that no one's still using, there's no point to that. And so I think that you should be willing to take a step back and like, okay, what is the best model that answers the class of questions the business has today, and not just like the class of questions that we've had previously. And you should know that that's going to be dynamic and changes, and you're probably not going to have one class of models that will do everything.
Maybe this is the answer to the question I'm going to ask, which you kind of raised earlier with AI. What is the future for data scientists? So is it being able to take a step back and look at something that hasn't been done before? The questions, knowing what the questions are, is that the role?
I think it's definitely part of the role. I'm going to answer this from a forecasting standpoint. I think that other data scientists would probably disagree, but from my lens, knowing that once again, no forecast models used to answer everything, and you're searching for the best model is often just chasing, epsilons of accuracy and gaining no insights from it. That's probably not worth your time. you should still know how to use these tools because they're very powerful and they're only becoming more powerful, but they're not going to probably, at least in their current state, they're not going to get you all the way. And they're also, you have to be careful of not becoming inundated in insights, right? There's some level of being able to decipher good insights from just generic insight. And these things are going to be able to produce insights at infinite speed, but maybe 1 out of 10,000 of them will be good. And then your job is, as a practitioner, which ones do you actually build around, or which ones do you try and leverage? That's something that we're all figuring out in real time. And I struggle with that quite frequently as well.
We've covered a lot of different issues. I'm wondering if there was something that you hoped to talk about or you think we missed asking you a question about that you want to share?
I guess it's a pretty comprehensive view of at least my forecasting world. But, I think maybe if I could push the field further, at least within tourism and hospitality, I would say the coupled supply thing is kind of the biggest challenge that I see. Most organizations forecast them separately, and I do think that does run into identification problems, and it's kind of it's a mistake both for accuracy, but also for understanding holistically, how the business is doing or how the organization is doing, and how it affects other parts of the market or the world around it. And then something about lead times. Lead times for us are the actual object that we forecast. One of the questions I always get from reviewers on any paper about lead times is, why are you modeling the lead times? They're like, well, because they're important to us. So be open-minded about lead times as something that you forecast by yourself.
One more question about your whole career and everything you have done so far, and you have done a lot. Is there anything that you believed early on in your career about forecasting and then you changed your mind completely afterwards? Is there anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think that most of it is that early on in my career, I thought the whole entire game was accuracy, full stop. I thought that was the only thing that mattered in a forecast model, that a better forecast just meant a more accurate one no matter what. And I think a lot of my more recent work is kind of me changing my mind about that in public and kind of understanding the political institutions that live within organizations and how we use forecasts. And once you see the word forecast is doing a number of different jobs, the honest question frequently stops being about how I make this more accurate. It becomes, which job is this number actually for? And then also remembering that sometimes you don't even want the most accurate number, that there are cases where that is, not the optimal forecast. And that's something that I've had to, come to terms with, that in my early career, I would found way too foreign.
Can you give an example of where that would be?
Yeah, I think that the plan case that we talked about before is probably the best example of that, where if it is a worse outcome to have less cash than more cash, your forecast should adjust, your plan case should be adjusted for that, or should be specified for that. It's not a unbiased estimate of the mean or the median, but it's probably an unbiased estimate of some quantile that the business, that serves a business need. I think that where this breaks down is the same thing that I've been talking about this time, is that people just want to use forecast to cover everything. They want it to be the most accurate word, and they also want it to be the conservative guess, and they also want to be able to measure, outcomes from it. And when you do that, forecast is lying to you. You built it to be conservative. It obliged. You're just kind of now asking it to tell you the truth. That's where these things fall apart.
Well, thank you so much, Harrison. It's been a pleasure. It was a fun conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun talking to you guys.
Thanks for joining us today, sharing your stories and your work with our audience. Thanks, George, for joining me as well.
Thanks, Lila, and thanks, Harrison. It was a great discussion.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and will continue to visit us at Forecasting Impact Podcast.
Thank you for taking your time and listening to Forecasting Impact. If you liked this show, please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. We appreciate you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next episode.